When you're dragging ass out of bed, the hairs must up on your head. You picture the 20th Maine, and you're happy once again. Fight the battle against being slow with Little Ground Top Bro.
As we mourn the loss of the Winter Lecture Series from the quality content you've come to love and respect from Addressing Gettysburg, let's all sit back with a warm cup of Addressing Gettysburg's Little Ground Top. Breathe deep that robust aroma as you open your fresh bag of Little Ground Top, roasted exclusively for us by Bantam Roasters. Then, let the notes of cacao, wildflowers, and toasted sugar dance on your tongue just before you hear information you'd never heard before and say, I never knew that. So get your bag of Little Ground Top online at addressinggettysburg.com/cafe or drop in at Bantam Roasters across from the Dobbin House. We hope you enjoy this trip down memory lane to those winter lectures that we've brought to you since 2020. Fight the battle against being slow with Little Ground Top, bro.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Like being last minute. Well, let me take all y'all in. I was up till 3 in the morning last night putting together slides, and Matt is not like going into a presentation without going over the slides to make sure he got them in order, but that's what's about to happen. So you see a look of a surprise. It's gonna be me right there, because I don't know. I hope they're in order. As much as me and the cat could get done last night, anyway. But I've had a good time with this program, though. We live. I need not tell you that. Well, it's her, huh? I need not tell you that I've followed Robert E. Lee my whole life, since I was 6 years old. A lot of these stories I'm going to tell you tonight reminded me of when I first read them when I was a kid, and how thrilling, once you get into, after you get past all the major battlefields, you get into places like where Lee slept. Or, we're not live, right? We are? Okay. where Lee, you might get into places like where Lee consummated his children, going to a select club or something like that. But that's a big word. My son doesn't understand you. So what we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen, is I need you to understand that, I hope you liked the last Lee program. I believe it was the post-war years. I believe that was the title of it. But I had an hour and a half. Chris says he's always punctual on the ending and stuff. I had an hour and a half on that one. I forget how long it was. But I had 5 years to do. Today I've got 50. And I've got the same amount of time. So, my theme basically is to cover Lee's life. I mean, that's the overarching theme. But what I want to do is try, because all of you, I suppose, are fans of the General and all the people out there. I want to try to spit in things or throw in things that you probably didn't know. I mean, they're not earth-shattering or anything like that, but I want to throw in a couple tidbits that might interest you, okay? So I've got basically 4 major periods that I'm going to try to cover. And I will go ahead and tell you right now, before we begin, a lot of you have been sitting here a while, and I've been very nervous about that upstairs because I got a lot of material. I was going to cover his pre-war, his pre-birth is a better word for it, his family lineage, which I think is such a big influence on him. I was going to cover, in no certain order, West Point, slavery, and then secession. All right, and those. But I'm going to try to do it all. But I'll spend more time on those 4 subjects because I thought it was the most interesting for you. Okay, so without further ado, let's see if these slides work right here. Well, maybe I ought to turn it on. Mother and I were fixing a cup of coffee, which I am not familiar with, and Mother couldn't get the toaster going. So I said to her, Mother, how about you plug it in? And that's about where we are with this. All right. So, without further ado, I thought the first thing that I've tried, y'all going to have to let me get settled in here. It always takes Matt 5-10 minutes to get rolling, right? If y'all watch tape on me. I really like Robert E. Lee. Have I not said that before? Okay, I mean, this is not really that big a moment, I don't think, earth-shattering moment. But, I mean, I've named my firstborn after him. I mean, what more honor can you do that? I have emulated Lee to no success, or tried to, for a long time. But one of the first things that grabbed me when I was putting together this program the other day is that we got seats. Y'all come on down. You're just going to have to plug yourself in. How Lee conducted himself. Lee, ladies and gentlemen, is someone that you want to talk about what modern day Lee could do for you. Lee is someone that has taught me how to interact with you, okay, and so forth. But anyway, I ran across this quote, and making his fourth debut, don't know, not nervous at all, I assure you, right here, is Mr. Benjamin Lee Atkinson. How about a round of applause for him? I'm going to stand beside him because he's not mic'd up, so I'm just going to stand beside him so he'll project it probably a little bit. Okay, so Ben's going to read you a quote on the definition of a gentleman, which I think is, I've tried to preach to my son that this is the way to go, and he just wants to get it over. All right, go ahead.
Lee composed the test for a true gentleman during the War for Southern Independence. The forbearing use of power does not only form a touchstone, but the manner in which an individual enjoys certain advantages over others is a test of a true gentleman. The power which the strong have over the weak, the magistrate over the citizen, the employer over the employed, the educated over the unlettered, the experienced over the confiding, even the clever over the silly. The forbearing or inoffensive use of all this power or authority, or a total abstinence from it, when the case admits it, will show the gentleman in plain light. The gentleman does not needlessly remind an offender of a wrong he may have committed against him. He can not only forgive, he can forget, and he strives for that nobleness of self and mindlessness of character, which impacts sufficient strength to let the past be the past. A true man of honor feels humbled himself when he cannot help humbling others.
Very kind of y'all to applaud, and that's it. All right. So, anything else to say? Okay. All right, let's go with Lee here before Chris gets too nervous over there. Okay. Our story begins, ladies and gentlemen, with, as I said earlier, this gentleman right here, which we probably don't know a lot about unless you're a Rev War fan. Your health. Right here. We're not starting with Robert, but we're starting with this background. This is Henry Lee III, who was born in 1756. His mother, Robert's grandmother, had been courted by none other than George Washington himself. At age 14, Henry went to Princeton, where he was classmates with Aaron Burr and James Madison, and it was here that he was first exposed to the revolutionary ideas and ideals. Henry returned home to the Fredericksburg area, to find his own father in favor of preserving our liberties, if necessary, at the expense of our blood. That's an actual quote. In 1776, on the recommendation of Patrick Henry, what's Patrick Henry say? Woo! We still got some history lovers out there, right? Never had a anger management issue. Henry received a commission as a captain in the Virginia cavalry. Henry was a cool customer with a dash about him. Dressed in green jackets, bearskin helmets, and long-bore pistols, his command became known for moving fast and striking hard. He conducted reconnaissance forage missions around Morristown and Valley Forge using stealth and audacity. Henry planned and the Lee Legion captured a superior British garrison at Paulus Hook, New Jersey in 1779. And Henry received a citation and gold medal from none other than Congress itself, one of only 9 issued during the Revolution. See, I told you I'd be telling you stuff right here. Henry later, I could never, writing this thing, I could never figure out whether to call him Henry or Lee. Because, if you were to put the many times as I typed Lee in this document, Lee, right here. So I just named him Henry, right here. So anyway, he gets the gold medal. He's later transferred to the Carolinas, and his harassment of Cornwallis supply line forced, in part, do not write me letters, I'm not a Rev War historian, the British Army to retreat to Virginia. Henry Lee stood with none other than Lafayette at the British surrender at Yorktown, and he emerges from the war as a hero. He's 26 years old. Now, he makes his way back to the northern neck of Virginia, which, if you don't know, is east of Fredericksburg. And within a few weeks, he married his cousin, Matilda Lee. And they didn't even have to go to the courthouse to change it. I once knew 2 Smiths that married each other back in Chickasaw County, and they weren't related. There's a lot of Smiths, though. After the death of her brother, Matilda had come into possession of Stratford Estate. Benjamin? Yep, there you go. Right there. There he is. That's a picture of him where he still liked me. Thought I was cool, didn't shrink down in the seat. Right there. We were there for Robert Lee's birthday. Okay, so this is where, now keep up with me here. This is Henry Lee's first wife, Matilda. I'll come back to that in a minute. This is her house. This is what she inherits. Now, obviously, when Henry married Matilda, it increased his fortune. With the backing of Washington, he entered politics with his election to the Continental Congress in 1785. Let me tell you how this works, ladies and gentlemen, if I can chase a rabbit real briefly. Men used to sit around, who could only vote back then, men used to sit around and wait on, they'd sit, some of them, not all of them, would sit up at the courthouse square and drink all day. That's why, I don't know if you remember, Mother, you couldn't drink on voting day. That's the reason. They didn't want all those men getting drunk on the square and everything. Well, anyway, they're doing that. And nobody had voted yet until George Washington showed up. Not that he was drinking. But when George Washington showed up, and then he went inside and he voted, and the rumors started to go out, well, George has voted for Henry Lee III. Everybody goes votes, because that's what George did. Can you imagine it working like that today? So anyway, George Washington gets Henry elected by just showing up to the poll. Now, like Washington, Henry was a Federalist and which means he believed narrow interests should be subordinated to the national interest. this country, going into Robert E. Lee, what I'll do at the end of this program, this country had not defined yet what the role of the central government was. We've raked all these things off. Don't get me going on my soapbox about lost cause and so forth. They debated this stuff. I mean, this was a true debate. I mean, what should be the size and the role of the federal government? And this is going back to his father. Henry fought the ratification of the Constitution in Virginia and backed the fought for the ratification of the Constitution, United States Constitution, and backed the opening "We the People" over "We the States." Later, while governor of Virginia, he was handpicked by Washington to lead 13,000 militia to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 in your gracious state of Pennsylvania. And you know what? It worked. But the legislature fired Lee because he was gone so long, leaving him bitter for the rest of his life about politics. And when Washington died in 1799, it was Henry who was asked to give the funeral oration before Congress. First in war,
first in the hearts of his countrymen.
First in the hearts of his countrymen. The impetuous manner which had won him fame on the battlefield did not leave Henry in peacetime. I'm telling you all this because of Robert E. Lee. And this is important. Henry proceeded to take great risk with his newfound wealth. From Matilda, he bought 500 acres, for example, at Great Falls, Virginia. His vision was to build a town named Matildaville. Whatever name went after your wife. Chip. While linking the western and eastern lands via canal. And so he wanted a canal in the city and a river and all that. But none of this came to fruition, and he lost money. And he tried to dig himself out by buying more land and borrowing more money. Yeah, sounds like today. He lost that too. He involved both Jefferson and Washington in selling the same tract of land to two buyers. Washington passed it off, but Jefferson took it public. And this started a feud right there. His father, Henry Lee's father, I guess that would be Henry Lee II, cut him out of his will. In 1790, on her deathbed, Matilda, his wife, put her estate in trust for her two children. Always on the move, 3 years later, he had set his sights on the daughter of Charles Carter. Doesn't that sound good with the southern accent? Carter. 19 years old. What would he have been? Around early 30s maybe? She was one of, I'm going to try to make you feel better about yourself. She was one of 21 children. Oh, I have it written down. I'm going to impress myself here. Henry was 37. a great liloquist who quoted long passages of the classics while driving a carriage with not 2, not 4, but 6 horses. Thank you, whoever laughed. Anne was smitten, and they were wed on June 30th of 1793. Henry's father-in-law was wise enough to place Anne's inheritance in a trust, secure from all debtors, and the couple moved to Stratford. If I could chase a rabbit real briefly here, I got to keep going, but come on, Matt. Shirley Plantation is where the wedding took place. I forget. I'm sorry. I tried to find a picture of it for y'all, but you know, back in the 1700s, there was a lot of arranged marriages. And in one of these arranged marriages in the Carter family, this girl really didn't want to marry this fella. And so she got this diamond ring, and, you know, to just show him up, she went over to the window, put that diamond ring on, went over to the window, and carved her name into her initials into the glass. because diamonds will cut glass. And if you go to Shirley today, that glass, that window pane is still there. And when Ann Hill Carter Lee married Henry, it has successive generations. Robert E. Lee's mother's initials are in that window right there. I told you I'd try to think. Thanks very much. All right. You've been there. We went there when I was working at Petersburg. All right. Henry and Anne would have 5 children, but the 4th one is the most important. On January 19th of 1807, on a cold winter morning, inside the East Chamber, on the main floor of Stratford, in that chamber right there, as Douglas Southall Freeman would say, I've gotten a big kick out of this with my friend Rob, we used to say, this is his words, an unblemished boy was born. In the same room, ladies and gentlemen, where Richard Henry and Francis Lightfoot Lee were both born also. Both of those men were signers of the Declaration. Look at what you wrapping all this together. All right. She named him. What's that middle name? After 2 of his mother's brothers. That's where Robert and Edward comes from. Okay, so Harry's still being Harry. And as debts continue to mount, I forgot I had that one in there. Okay, I told you I had a few surprises. Do not tell those people, all right, if you ever go there. But very nice dose that I had at Stratford. But do you remember this? When they walked on, I reached over and I touched it. Yeah. Who did it? And I instantly went and bought a lottery ticket. I touched it. Okay, here's the main hall. As debts continued to mount, creditors began to appear at Stratford. At one point, Henry placed chains over the doors. There's a story you won't hear there. To keep the household contents from being taken in lieu of debt. I mean, if you owe somebody, they just come up to your house with a wagon and just come on in and just take the cabinet, You got to lock the door down. In those times, you could be put in jail for debt. And Henry made himself mobile during this time. In 1809, he finally gave up the chase and went to jail for a year. When his brothers finally got the money together to pay off his most pressing debts, Henry was free. But in 1808, to back up a little bit, Henry and Matilda's oldest boy, Henry IV, now remember, 2 marriages, Matilda, Anne. His first wife's boy, remember, she put it in trust, not her husband. First boy comes of age, he gets the house. Okay? We'll see the wheels rolling now. Yeah, I'll get you. So Henry IV is now the master of Stratford. Although Anne's stepson was willing for everyone to stay, Anne had had enough of her husband and told him she was leaving for Alexandria. It was a wise choice by Anne, though. I mean, there was 3 uncles there, a dozen cousins lived within 5 blocks. They lived at 3 locations within 5 blocks. But the most time, the Anne's family, including Robert, lived at 3 locations in Alexandria. But for the most part, and they lived here twice, it was at this shabby little place right here that would only featured 6 bedrooms, 4.5 baths, and 8,145 square feet, which was her, I think it was a Fitzhugh that owned the house. Not bad rebound, though, if you go bankrupt, huh? Henry, though, just never had any luck. In 1812, he happened to be in Baltimore, Maryland. I've been meaning to go look this up. as I said earlier, Henry's a Federalist, and he. I wasn't able to figure this out. Like I said, I barely finished this program. But for some reason, the Federalists opposed the War of 1812. And I'll figure that out later, okay? But Henry was a Federalist. Well, they had this, to back up a little bit, they had this newspaper editor there that was anti-war. And as you know, back then, if you had a problem with publishing or something, you just went over there with the stick and got it straightened out, you know, just working it out, but domestic style. But this publisher got ran out of Baltimore, and he went to Georgetown, and he republished the paper, printed off more editions, and then came back to Baltimore, rented a house or got a house somehow, and started distributing the paper again. Well, word got around that he was back in town after they done told him to leave. And they didn't like that. And so that's a problem. And so they ended up coming over, and they had this standoff. Well, somehow Henry Lee gets involved in this whole deal. And he is asked to come advise them how to defend the house from this mob that is forming outside. Now, there's a pretty cool story, and you can find online, which I was very impressed, you can actually find the affidavits that from the eyewitnesses, and I'll leave you to that if you really want all the detail. But suffice it to say that shooting started, and one of the rioters is killed in the streets. You know, they pushed furniture up against the doors. They barricaded themselves in there. They called out the militia. And that took a while, and they showed up. But anyway, they have a parlay once the militia shows up, and they say, well, we'll just let you, we'll escort you out here, and we'll put you in the jail in order for safekeeping. And so Henry Lee advised against the editor's better judgment that they do that, and so they were in the jail. Well, the next day, the mob comes back, and they storm the jail. And they get inside. They had to get through 3 iron doors. We don't know if they got the key or they ripped them out. Nobody knows how they got in there, but they got in there. And if you can imagine, there was about 19 of them in the room. I may be slightly off, but I think 19 of them were in this jail cell all together. And can you imagine hearing those rioters coming through, each one, there's nowhere to go because you're in a jail. They don't exactly build them for escape. So, rough living. But they get in there, and they just seize them. So some of the 19 were able to escape and just blend in with the crowd, if you can imagine. But Henry Lee was so prominent that they knew who he was. And along with the editor and probably 4 or 5 more, they started beating the crap out of him until they thought he was dead. And when they drug his body down, which he's still conscious or unconscious, whatever, they drug him down. They had these long steps on the jail. They threw everybody off the steps into the street. Then some guy came by and started sticking Henry with a penknife. Right? And so he starts bleeding. Now he's trying to play possum, And another guy comes along and tries to cut the end of his nose off. I don't know what for, but a souvenir. But you're paying attention now, aren't you, kid? To see if he was still alive, another guy, or maybe the same guy, went and got candles. They opened his eyelids up, poured hot wax in there. That'd beat the tar out of him. And the only reason that him and the rest of them lived is the doctor said, I'm going to take him away from here and let him die. And so since they thought they were dead, they let him go. They loaded him up, threw him in the back of a wagon. Henry is, health-wise is done. How do you ever overcome that? So anyway, he goes back to Alexandria, and it's never the same. His health never recovered. In 1813, the year after, in order to escape his creditors and try to salvage his health, Henry sailed away to the Caribbean. Robert was 6 years old. He never saw his father again. Light Horse Henry Lee died at the home of his old commander, Nathaniel Greene, trying to make his way back home in 1818. Robert was 11 years old by that time, and out of the time, in 11 years, he had spent a total of 34 months in the company of his father. Now, Robert would grow up in Alexandria and at times would still spend weeks at Stratford. Upon the death of his father, he began to take on more and more responsibilities around the house, especially since his mother's health continued to fail. Lee was devoted to his mother. She buttressed the morning and evening with prayers, taught him the church catechism, and schoolmates remembered he would rush home during breaks to help or take her for pleasure rides in a carriage. She once said that Robert was, quote, son and daughter and everything to me. Lee apparently first attended family plantation schools in Fauquier County. His first formal school was at age 14 at the Alexandria Academy. Does that not impress you? I mean, I got a picture. All right. Lee had a classical education here, reading Caesar, Virgil, Tacitus, am I saying that right? Homer, and Xenophon? Say it? Xenophon. Algebra was taught along with, you see what I'm reading, or not reading. Algebra was taught along with the first 6 books of the Euclid. At 17, Ann Hill Carter scraped together the $10 tuition to send Robert to the school run by Benjamin Hollowell. And here Lee brushed up on his calculus, his chemistry, and even astronomy. These lessons rounded out his education as he prepared to enter West Point Academy in 1825. Now, Lee's attendance at West Point is well documented. He was there from July of 1825 to July of 1829. Now, let me try to throw in a few tidbits you might not know. The curriculum Lee and the rest of the cadets took was based on the French. Come on, Al, I'm waiting on you to help me out here. École Polytech. Yes. Which was the leading institution of the day. Cadets took advanced classes in mathematics, practical sciences, and engineering with a touch of philosophy and history to round out the studies. Since Ben has been going to math tutoring the past few weeks, maybe he can look up there and define this for us right here. So how does these studies work in a practical sense? Advanced calculus, trigonometry, and descriptive geometry aided in designing fortifications. Natural sciences such as biology and astronomy helped assess terrain and master positioning. The surveying craft was also taught with an emphasis on draftsmanship, to draw plot maps and design structural diagrams. If this wasn't enough, daily drilling took place. All exams were oral, and of course, there was no pressure. Of the 46 cadets that entered the academy with Lee, the curriculum and daily regimen would get rid of half of them. In this environment, Lee excelled. Thank you. She looked at her husband. I said, well, I made a point right there. Okay, she liked that. Lee also made wise decisions. When he entered West Point in 1825, the class celebrated the 4th by getting drunk and forming a snake dance and arriving at the guard post so drunk that they couldn't stand up. Superintendent Thayer banned all grog even on Washington's birthday. That's harsh. And Christmas. Yeah. Well, a year later, during Christmas of 1826, the cadets have had enough of this. And they decided to party it on up. And mixing a good eggnog in the North Barracks, where Lee was housed, the revelry grew to a fever pitch. And soon, when the officers reported, they were chased back to their rooms. And at some point, being, I imagine they had to be Southerners, whoever did this, Southern cadets, Southern State cadets. They decided that they would go out on the plains and discharge firearms. For good measure. Well, that's cool, you know. So anyway, throwing logs, breaking windows, chasing professors back to their rooms. 70 of the 250 cadets were implicated, including, no, not Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis. 19 of them were charged, 12 were ultimately dismissed, including, for you Gettysburg buffs, you're going to want to write this down, B.G. Humphreys. Benjamin G. Humphreys, 21st Mississippi. 7 were pardoned by John Quincy Adams, but Lee and his fellow roommate, Joseph Eggleston Johnson, were never implicated. In July of 1829, he graduated second in his class of 46 with a remarkable record of no demerits for misconduct. He was a staff sergeant and in 1826 was named an assistant professor of mathematics. In his final year, Lee was named adjutant of the Corps of Cadets, despite being the second-ranked cadet academically. Anybody remember the first?
Charles Smith.
I think between the two you got it. Charles Mason. Right there. Who went on to do nothing. All right. Yeah, I mean, he had a good life, man. He once remarked during the Civil War, though, that he didn't quite reading about Lee in the paper, it didn't quite work out for him. It should have been a time of merriment, but Lee had to return home to the deathbed of his mother. Now, this is what happens at 2:30 in the morning last night. When you throw in a slide, deathbed. Okay? So this has nothing to do with Robert E. Lee's mother, but it'll suffice. Okay? In other words, you get the picture. Lee began to mix the, you probably know what that painting is, don't you, in that red jacket? I bet you do. He began to mix the medicines personally. And one family member recalled that her eyes never left Robert when he was in the room. I guess she couldn't speak. She died on July 10th of 1829. She was 56. Robert, overcome with grief, could not attend the funeral. To back up a little, in the same year, that Light Horse Harry died, another scandal erupted around the Lee family. Henry Lee IV. You remember Henry Light Horse Harry Lee's son? You're going to love this one. I've been waiting all day, a long time to tell you this one. Well, Robert E. Lee's half brother. Remember, he inherited Stratford. Apparently, this Henry IV, wasn't any better with money than his daddy. And by 1827, he had a lien against him for $9,000. He had to sell Stratford in 1828. He went to work for Andrew Jackson as a pseudo-biographer, but Henry had gained Jackson's attention with his polemic political writings. Quote, Jackson found these last to be in such a temper that matched his own, and he felt much gratitude to Lee. Indicted, I-N-D-I-T-E-D. Upon gaining the presidency, Jackson got him a job at the U.S. Consul to Morocco, but when Henry IV's name became before the Senate, he didn't get one vote. But he's already in Morocco. So we got a problem. So why did he not get any votes? Well, he had been married to Anne McCarty. In 1818, she gave birth to a daughter, but 2 years later, and the reason I have this picture is so you can see it for yourself. 2 years later, I suppose, the little girl, being 2 years old, tragically fell to her death on the front steps of Stratford. She was the second child to do so in 40 years. same spot. Anne took to laudanum, which will always fix the problem. And her 16-year-old sister Elizabeth moved in to help take care of her. With Anne debilitated, the notorious profligate Henry IV fell into scandal with his young sister-in-law, who was also his ward, which means his legal charge, and apparently embezzled some of the assets too, just for good measure. The scandal haunted Henry so much for the rest of his life, and he became known as not Light Horse, but Black Horse. This scandal, ladies and gentlemen, broke anew in the papers with Morocco and all that when Robert E. Lee was on his first assignment after West Point at Cockspur Island outside of Savannah, Georgia. Now, Lee is reading about this, and obviously he's an adult now. Now, you think about this. Everything I've told you, the reason I went through all this, his father, his half-brother, what is this teaching Lee? What influences is his mother having on him? His pious mother, always reserved, always. This is molding Robert E. Lee. To quote Freeman, doubtless as he read by the candle of his crude quarters on Cockspur Island the story of his brother's misdeeds, he was strengthened in his resolution to efface by his own conduct the blot on the proud scutcheon of the Lees. Such things in a man's life are not to be proved by citation or confirmed by footnotes, but there is every reason to believe that the stern morality of Robert Lee was stiffened by the warning of his brother's fall. In exactly the same way, the rigid exactness of the son in all money matters, small and large, was a reaction from his father's laxness. Whew. Yeah. Now, Lee transferred back to Fortress Monroe in 1831, and since he was closer to the Washington area, he renewed his interest in Mary Custis. Her father was George Washington Parke Custis, the owner of Arlington, and her mother was Mary Lee Fitzhugh. So Robert Edward Lee came over to see his cousin, who was the daughter of Mary Lee Fitzhugh. We're going to have a lot of Marys here for a little while, all right? Until one of the Marys dies, okay? But bear with me. Their only child, George Washington Parke Custis and Mary Fitzhugh Lee Fitzhugh's only child was Mary. Also, now being the only child probably allowed her, like it does today, to be spoiled. And she's described by one author as having, quote, an uninhibited personality, a quick temper, a clever intellect, and a mind of her own. One family member said that Mary, quote, spoke whatever came in her mind, but it was over in a moment. She was also a pretty good flirt, who had plenty of suitors apparently, including some congressmen, and none other than Sam Houston. Mary took to religion to soften her sharp edges. She kept a diary and so forth. Was a lady of letters. The summer of 1830 apparently brought the two young people into courtship, and by September they were engaged. How you like that for moving? Lee returned to Fortress Monroe after his leave was over, but the two continued to have letter exchanges. At first, Mary's father apparently did not give permission for his only child to marry a broke Army officer and a family history that was suspect, but eventually, I suppose, Robert won him over. Lee, on the other hand, Robert, that is, gained access to the significant estate that Mary was inheriting and the lineage of the Washington line through the only step-granddaughter of America's icon. Remember, people, George Washington didn't have any children. Martha had 2 children when she married George. Her first husband died. And that's the line, Custis. That's the line that Lee is going to tie into. So, all right, bear with me. Let's chase this rabbit for a minute. All right, so this is what you do at 3 in the morning. George Washington's wife Martha's son died, leaving George Washington and Martha to raise George Washington Parke Custis. So as a young kid, he was in the shadow of Washington. If that means George Washington raised his grandchild, is what I'm telling you. All right. Apparently adored them. Right there. Okay, so I think I got that right. So they got engaged. And have no doubt, Robert's love letters to Mary are show that he is quite smitten with her. Eventually, G.W. Parke Custis relented, and on a rainy night on June 30th, 1831, the couple was married in the family parlor of Arlington. Right there. Although in love, the partnership required some inevitable adjustment. No, well, so much for paying attention. Oh, that would be a winner. Robert was punctual. Neat. Always, thank you. Always dressed meticulously. Mary was none of this. She had great indifference to dress and was never on time. All right. Apparently she went to a spring, a spa basically one time, one of those hot springs. And she appeared in a homemade, when the public was, all the guests were gathering, she attended in some blue calico dress, if you can imagine, that she had made herself with these natty gloves that didn't even match. One time, I'll throw this one in just because I'm in a good mood. One time before the war, Lee they were having a party over at Arlington, and Lee went up to a lady that was at the party, and she goes, "Would you mind telling Mrs. Lee that her slip is showing? If I say anything, she will ignore me." The reason I'm telling you this is so you get a flavor of Mary, all right? Because we never talk about Mary. But Robert loved her. One more story. Robert Lee Jr., I'm getting a little ahead of the story, would say that his father would always be ready to go to church. Dress uniform, military, Sunday, ready to go. And he would be trying to, quote, rally, according to Robert Lee Jr., rally his mother to come on. But Mary would invariably forget something. And Lee, in frustration, would just take out walking by himself. Yeah. So she didn't like housekeeping, and this led to a disagreement. She wrote one of her, I believe it was her cousins, don't quote me on that my husband scolds me morning and evening. She made an effort, though, to become better in her roles, and Lee, in turn, tried to learn patience. They accepted each other's differences, and on June 30th of 1864, during the Civil War, in the midst of the siege of Petersburg. Think about this, June 30th. Right? I think something pretty big happens on June 30th of 1864. I'll allow you to look that up. Oh, thank you, before I forget. Thank you for all the people that wrote me to tell me which movies John Wayne was a Confederate in. On June 30th, 1864, in the midst of the siege of Petersburg, Robert wrote Mary, quote, "Do you remember what a happy day 33 years ago this was? How many hopes and pleasures it gave birth to." Now, getting back to the present time, 1830, Mary returned with Robert to Fortress Monroe, and she would accompany him on all of his deployments except to Texas and the Mexican War. Nevertheless, her heart was always at Arlington. Right there. Okay. In 1834, Lee was reassigned to the chief engineer's office in Washington. They now had a son named Custis. Custis Lee, if you're getting confused. George Washington Custis Lee. Anyway, the reassignment allowed Lee to be with Mary, though. In 1835, Lee travels to survey a boundary dispute between Michigan and Ohio, and it goes to show that the United States of America, the United States government, I should say, was utilizing its best engineering school for good. And the best engineering school in America at that time, practically the only one probably, was West Point Military Academy. See what they're training these soldiers to do? Not only train them to fight, you train them to do something for the country. Okay, a skill. From 1837 to 1839, Lee worked on stabilizing the river flow in the harbor situation in St. Louis, Missouri. And the next time you're in St. Louis, remember that. Robert E. Lee was there. And Congress eventually didn't fund the project, but Lee gained valuable experience with leadership trying to supervise the work. One of his assistants during that trip, or during part of the time, was none other than a gentleman named Montgomery Meigs, who would later have a pivotal role in transforming Arlington. But yeah. While at St. Louis, Lee is promoted to captain. In 1841, the entire family is going to move to Brooklyn, New York, where Lee observes renovations and repairs to Fort Hamilton and New York Harbor defenses for the next 5 years. Now, what can I tell you about Lee that you didn't know? When Mary went back to Arlington, always remember, Mary's heart is at Arlington. And if I didn't stress it enough, Mary is an independent soul. Okay? I mean, they love each other, but she's independent. And when she went back, I mean, Robert's writing these letters saying, "Oh, I miss you. I miss the kids," you know. Lee was left with a dog named Speck. All right? Who reportedly, Lee wrote his wife or maybe one of his children that the dog was sitting there watching him while he was writing at his desk, and he thought the dog knew what he was thinking. Anyway, they were going to church one day, and what this illustrates is that Speck jumped out of the second-story window just to accompany the family to church. All right. He also reportedly planted a tree in front of his quarters, which is pretty cool, you know, in the middle of New York City. All right, you can go see a tree that Robert E. Lee planted. Not really. All right. In early 1846, can't have a tree. In early 1846, word arrived from Arlington that a seventh child had been born. Mildred Child. Now, Lee was 39 and Mary was 38. Now, if you go back to Robert E. Lee's mother, I said she was 1 of 21. Mary Lee, Robert's mother, only had 7. She was done at 38, which was relatively young if you lived that long to stop. I mean, you just went going. You kept going. You know? But it would affect her health. I don't know exactly what was happening, but all these childbirths were wearing her down. So anyway, what I put up here is all the Lee children. In 1846, Custis was the oldest. From left to right, Custis was the oldest at 14. Mary was 11. Rooney was nearing 9. He's obviously not 9 there. But at age 9, he had accidentally chopped off the tips of his fingers in a threshing machine that his father told him to stay away from. And he didn't heed his advice, which made Robert very angry, which made Daddy very angry, because he wouldn't listen. Over here. How many of you knew that Rooney was missing fingertips, though, huh? People pay good money for this. Annie was 6.5, and Agnes was 5. Robert Jr. was 2.5, and leaving Mildred in the cradle as a baby. All right. Out of all the pictures, and I guess it's because of the resolution. I don't know, you know. I'm not going to cover this one anymore, the children, but I'm pointing her out, though, ladies and gentlemen, because she dies in 1862. And to show you the man that Robert E. Lee was, I'm not saying this is a great thing or whatever, but just give you a glimpse into who he was. It was either Walter Taylor or Charles Marshall said that a letter arrived, a personal letter, and Lee was reading it, and he had some army business. You know, they're in and out of Lee's tent. And he went in there to see Lee about some business, and he went out the tent. And Lee continued reading the letter, you know, with his spectacles on. And the staff officer came back a few minutes later. Well, he didn't knock because he'd just been there, you know, so he had something he forgot. So he walked on in, and Lee was weeping. Lee had held himself together long enough to conduct that army business before he could turn himself to his personal. And that was her. Anyway, a couple of pictures you might like. This is Mary, his wife. Never seen that picture before this program. Now, this right here is Robert E. Lee Jr. And when you were a baby back then, boys were dressed the same way as girls in the early years. Look, he didn't look at you when you looked at him. All right. Pretty. Any of y'all know how to do those curls? I really need some. I got a daddy-daughter dance tonight, and I really could use some tips here. Brushing my hair. Is it straight?
Straight off your head.
That's good. I like that, Al.
Sorry.
Oh, this is a picture of Lee with Rooney in 1845. Talk about coming straight off your head. Where you see it. In 1846, Lee leaves for the war with Mexico, and he's glad to get away from New York. He joins the staff of Winfield Scott, the general, and Robert would make a lifelong, lasting impression, and the two men would become friends. From Veracruz to Mexico City, Lee found routes of attack. That's routes, not routes. Through foreboding terrain left undefended by the Mexican army. He is breveted to major after the Battle of Cerro Gordo on April 18th of 1847. Now, let me take you back to where I told you at the beginning of this talk that I had a lot of things that jarred my memory. My girls are in the 2nd grade right now, and they still love their father. Yes. We need to reiterate. When I was in 2nd grade, I had a what you call it? What did Miss Eller teach? Arts? What would you call that? Yeah, well, what was the subject, though, Mother? Okay. Well, we ran out of things to do at the end of the year. And she sat down. I wish I knew what the book was, but she sat down and started reading us stories of American heroes. Okay, to the class, to fill up the last week. And one of those stories, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I'm going to tell it because y'all need a break anyway. All right, is she told the story of Robert E. Lee at Cerro Gordo, and the story when Lee was out reconnoitering. You got to remember, Robert E. Lee is nobody famous at this point. I mean, he's a captain. You know how many captains are in the Mexican War? So anyway, Lee goes out on this scouting expedition, and he ends up getting pinned down, or trapped, I guess you could say, behind Mexican lines when these, I don't know exactly how it happened, but he had to dive behind a log in order to save or to hide. And he had to stay there for several hours. And I remember Mrs. Ellard, Old South, hair, going inside, and very enunciated things, very clearly. She talked about Lee having to sit there very still while the ants were biting him all over, because the Mexicans, some of the Mexican army was less than 3 feet away, sitting on that log with their backs to him. Nobody ever stepped over, Some of them walked by him to use the bathroom, but never stepped on him in that grass. Anyway, when I got to this portion of the program, it brought back memories of Mrs. Ellard. I don't know if I have a seminal moment that hooks me in or something, but that will be one of the big ones. Now, Lee also fights at Contreras. You're going to like this one. Churubusco, and he's wounded at Chapultepec. Now, I got that one. Come on now. Doing the best I can with this Mississippi public education. I don't know what y'all want me to do around here. May just have to go outside. During the campaign, he received 2 more brevets to lieutenant colonel and colonel. However, he returned to his regular rank of captain after the war until his transfer to the cavalry in 1855. So if you're following me here, ladies and gentlemen, it took him 16 years to make captain in the peacetime army. Now, to back up, upon returning from Mexico, Lee was assigned to Baltimore to oversee the construction of Fort Carroll, I'll need you again, Al, in the middle of the Patapsco River. That's exactly what I thought. All right. The 1850s proved a difficult time for Lee, though. And the Army sent him on wayward assignments. His wife's health was breaking down from childbearing and probably arthritic hips. And his father-in-law's health was declining also. In 1852, Lee left Baltimore, and over his strenuous objections, he was appointed to the West Point Military Academy. Let me get up here. I learned with much regret the determination of the Secretary of War to assign me to that duty, and I fear I cannot realize his expectations in the management of an institution requiring more skill and more experience than I command. How do you do that? Do you see that's called, Benjamin? That's called tact. This is how you say very, very nicely, I don't want the job. I don't want to leave my family. But orders were orders. Can you ever imagine? And Lee, though, got a nice house and a long assignment. And there was also another plum trying to tell you things you didn't know. His oldest boy, George Washington Custis Lee, attended West Point at the same time his daddy was superintendent. And unlike his daddy,
He got the notes.
he graduated first in 1854. Now, did you know that? All right. Now, while on leave, now I want you to know, just to go back, just to show you what it's like being a park ranger, not being able to check your slides. I was supposed to have a slide of West Point, but got there, was no West Point. So we just went with it. And I found another one. While on leave after the death of his mother-in-law, Mrs. Custis, Lee knelt at the altar at Christ Church in Alexandria and professed his faith along with his 2 daughters. He knew the catechism, he had a strong moral compass, but he had not joined the church, although he attended services regularly. Quote, Lee's correspondence does not contain the echo of liaison, the shadow of an oath, or the stain of a single obscene suggestion, wrote Douglas. Tradition has it that the Right Reverend John Johns said to him upon his confirmation, "Colonel Lee, if you will make a valiant a soldier for Christ as you have made for your country, the church will be as proud of you as your country now is." Robert E. Lee's pew. Now, if you go there, probably not going to see that. But if you do happen to go there, it's pew number 46. Now, on the theme of telling you things about Lee you probably didn't know, while at West Point, he was part of the Napoleon Club with D.H. Mahan as president. None other than George McClellan gave a presentation before the club, and during his 2 years, I found this interesting, is why I wrote it down. During his 2 years and 7 months at the academy, he withdrew 6 magazines and 48 books from the library. Okay? Some of the breakdown of types include 6 on geography, 1 on forestry, 8 on architecture, 5 on military law. He had a lot of court martials. 1 on French and Spanish grammar. 15 on military biography, history, and the science of war. Of the 15 related to war, 7 related to Napoleon. Lee mostly concentrated his studies on Napoleon's Italian campaign of 1796, or if you're watching from the South today, Italian, right there. And also with the Egyptian operations. He also read on the Russian campaign. In 1855, he finally escaped West Point, and in order to gain promotion to lieutenant colonel, he had to go to Camp Cooper, Texas. And ironically, when he went to Texas, ladies and gentlemen, he serves under Colonel Albert Sidney Johnson. For those of you that don't read anything besides Gettysburg, that's the dude that gets shot at Shiloh. All right? Yeah. Okay. So, in 1857, Lee's father-in-law, G.W. Parke Custis, died, leaving Arlington in financial disarray. Lee tried to find a manager to run this estate. Why does he want a manager, ladies and gentlemen? Because he don't want to deal with it. But he couldn't find anything. So this necessitated him taking a leave of absence. Lee took over thousands of acres and approximately 190 slaves across 3 plantations. His father-in-law was just a horrible manager, more interested in painting, talking about his illustrious grandfather than actually running the place. The ledger books reflected this too, with massive debts. This also brought Lee into an area he was reluctant to go ever. You didn't like fooling with it. And that was slavery. This is one of the Custis slaves. There were 63 slaves at Arlington specifically, and now Lee had to manage them also. Now look, I told y'all I would give y'all a overview of this whole time period, because I see it a lot today in the literature and so forth. But let me just say from the very beginning, it's a no-win situation for the white guy from Mississippi. I mean, there's nothing that I'm either going to spend too short a time, I'm going to spend too long a time, I'm not going to say something that, or I'll say something that you don't like, or I'll say something that you do like, or something like that. I don't really find it, I'm around, I've studied the Civil War all day, I'm kind of immune to it. I don't have those strong feelings reading about it every day anymore. It's history to me. And that's the way I approach it. Okay? So my point is, in telling you all this, if you like part of what I'm about to tell you and you dislike portions of the other, then I'm probably being pretty balanced. And that's what I'm aiming to do, is tick all of you off. No, I'm kidding. Chris, stay up in the office. I'm kidding. Matt, exit stage left. All right, so Lee did own slaves. I'm backing up before Arlington. Lee did own slaves. He inherited an unknown number from his mother when she died. I tried to find out, but I don't think it's known. He apparently rented them out, though. And that is going to be a recurring theme. Lee's sister was specifically deeded a slave named Nat, the old coachman who served as the old coachman from Stratford estate. For some reason, perhaps because he was old and sick, Lee's sister gave Nat to Robert. And Nat accompanied Lee to Cockspur Island in Georgia in his first assignment where he died. So, there's an instance. Now, what happened to all the people owned by Robert E. Lee is not known. There are no records of Lee freeing them or selling them. Any of them. So Lee may have done either or none, or they may have died. Dr. James Liburn interviewed Robert E. Lee after the Civil War, and Liburn claimed that Lee, quote, had said that, quote, he had freed most of the Negroes before the war and sent some to Liberia. Lee's son, end of quote, Lee's son, Robert E. Lee Jr., claimed that, quote, he inherited 3 or 4 families of slaves and let them go a long time before the war. He also suggested that there were no official manumission papers, as he wanted to prevent the former enslaved people from being forced from the state, which was the law at the time. If you were free, you had to go. You had to leave. So this is all we know of Lee, or at least all I know of Lee as a direct owner. Now, Lee's views on slavery are interesting, and no, I'm not going to read that whole thing, okay? And they're posited in a few different references throughout his life, but probably the most often quoted is this 1856 letter where Lee wrote his views on the institution of slavery. It was written after the context of it is, it was written after a copy of President Pierce's State of the Union address admonishing abolitionist intrigue. Anyway, the speech was about that, and it arrived in Texas. If you would like to see President Pierce's full, they didn't call it State of the Union, they called it something else. What do they call it?
Annual message.
Annual message to Congress right there. You can look up Al Mackey's Civil War blog, where I read the whole thing. Lee described slavery, to paraphrase, quote, as a moral and political evil. He, however, noted that, quote, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race, and that, quote, the painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. He wrote that, quote, while we see the course of the final abolition of human slavery is onward, and we give it the aid of our prayers and all justifiable means in our power, we must leave the progress as well, the results in his hands. Now, many of Lee's comments are considered racist by the standards of our modern times. I'm just trying to, it's not the point, to overemphasize. The vast majority of Lee's letters do not touch on slavery. They don't. They're usually asking about, family matters and so forth, or saying he got something. So when he does talk about it, it is something to pay attention to. So what I've tried to do is, I don't want you to get the idea that he's sitting around, but I tried to pick up a couple instances where Lee is recorded talking about it. Now, as I said, this would not be the way we would talk today. In the book written by his son, Robert E. Lee Jr., Jr. said that Lee went to visit Colonel Thomas Carter at his home. This is right after the war in 65, been west of Richmond. And in talking with Colonel Carter about the situation of the farmers at that time in the South, they didn't have any more slaves, and their prospects for the future, quote, he urged him to get rid of the Negroes left on the farm, some 90-odd in number, principally women and children with a few old men, saying the government would provide for them, and advised him to secure white labor. The colonel told him he had to use for immediate needs such force as he had, meaning working force, being unable at that time to get whites. Whereupon General Lee remarked, I have always observed that wherever you find the Negro, everything is going down around him, and wherever you find a white man, you see everything around him improving. In March 12th of 1868, a letter to his son Robert Jr., Lee gave advice on farming and the people leaving the war behind. People have got to work now, he wrote. It is creditable to them to do so. Their bodies and their minds are benefited by it, and those who can and will work will be advanced by it. You will never prosper with the blacks, and it is abhorrent to a reflecting mind to be supporting and cherishing those who are plotting and working for your injury, all of whose sympathies and associations are antagonistic to yours. I wish them no evil in the world. On the contrary, will do every good in my power, and know that they are misled by those to whom they are given their confidence. But our material, social, and political interests are naturally with the whites. This is tough stuff. I mean, I don't even like reading it. Now, back to Arlington. When old man Custis dies, Lee took over managing his late father-in-law's slaves, but Lee did not own any of them. He did not own any of those slaves. Custis gave his son-in-law 5 years to emancipate them. In order to comply with the will's provisions, he would encumber a $50,000 debt, doing so on a $90,000 estate, settling the accounts and so forth. Now here we come to where our morality reaches reality. What would you do? Well, I don't know. I'll never be in that position. But, what a heck of horrible. In addition, Virginia law stipulated that free blacks had to move out of the state, while the old, infirm, and young must be provided for. There was no stipulation in his father-in-law's will to provide for this, which is a problem for Lee. In addition, apparently a rumor had circulated around Arlington among the slaves that they were immediately free, as you can see in the beginning of this, and this caused a revolt among some. Now, the following story I'm going to present like a trial, because it has been batted around depending on which book you pick up and so forth, and it just depends on who you read. So it's like a trial. The prosecution will go first and then the defense. The account you're reading is from the post-war years. The first time this account appears is before the war, twice in the New York Tribune on June 24th of 1859. In 1859, a slave named Wesley Norris, along with his cousin George Parks and Wesley's sister Mary, fled from Arlington and headed north. They were caught in Westminster, Maryland, where I had dinner last night, and held in the jail. The name of the overseer was named Gwynn, at least in the document you're reading, but his actual name was McQuinn. So the constable's name is right too, Dick Williams. Okay? In June of 1859, in Lee's ledger books, his accounting books for Arlington, he paid $321.14 to a Richard Williams. Okay? This is all verifiable. It happened. At least something happened. Okay? The whipping, as you're getting down to, is another issue and is the more controversial and contradictory of the account. Right here. In the original article in 1859, the constable would not whip the woman, so Lee personally whipped her instead. This is obviously not present in Norris's post-war account before you. Now, the defense. Lee wrote his son Custis shortly after the first story appeared in 1859. Quote, "The New York Tribune has attacked me for my treatment of your grandfather's slaves, but I will not reply." After the war, he told a friend, quote, that the statement is not true, but I had not thought, meaning this one, but I had not thought proper to publish a contradiction. And in another statement to the same recipient, he said, Lee wrote, "There is not a word of truth in it. No servant, soldier, or citizen that was ever employed by me can with truth charge me with bad treatment." And I might add, in the defense, the accounts are coming from a an abolitionist newspaper. So, it's like Fox versus CNN, You figure out which side's which in this. All right, but, you always have to look at the source. Any subject. Now, the Custis slaves were liberated in December of 62, and Lee retained two of them, Perry and George Parks. After they're freed, he retains them. They were hired as free black men and paid $8.20 a month to serve as cooks at Lee's mess. It's curious if Lee was mistreating the slaves that badly that they would choose to stay and work for him. Now, people, it's plausible that whipping happened. It's plausible. On the other hand, it's also plausible it didn't. So, in the old days we used to have, I don't know if y'all remember this, you used to be presented the facts, and then you had to come to a conclusion instead of being spoon-fed. Now, I could sit here, I could do the whole program on this. I don't have time. We got to eventually end, right? But, you just have to make up your own mind. Now, finally, just as a interesting story, there's, as far as slavery, there's the story of Selina Norris Gray, who is Wesley Norris, the account you just read. This is his sister, and was the personal maid of Mary Custis Lee, Robert E. Lee's wife. She was married to Thornton Gray in the same room in Arlington house that Robert and Mary were. Inside the house. They had 8 children, which they raised in one-room slave quarters. The parents staying downstairs and the kids staying in the loft. When the Lees left Arlington at the beginning of the war, Selina was entrusted with the keys to the house. Specifically, the cellar where many of Washington's personal heirlooms were stored. While General Irvin McDowell took the house as headquarters, soldiers started to break in and steal things. Selina scolded the Union soldiers and told them, quote, not to touch any of Mrs. Lee's things. She alerted McDowell to what was happening at the house, and he secured the remaining Washington items and sent them to the United States Patent Office across the river. And many of the Washington heirlooms you see in the Smithsonian today are from this episode that I just described. That's how they got there. Now, just to touch again, Selina and Mrs. Lee, Mary, stayed in touch for the rest of their lives, exchanged letters. The Custis family taught their slaves to read and write. Families that did that taught them to read and write, did it with their salvation in mind, usually. They wanted slaves to be able to read the Bible. And so they did. So Selina could write, of course. All right. Another topic. That's her. Sorry, forgot. Told you. Right there. Oh, by the way, Arlington House recently, or the Friends of Arlington House recently got this, if I remember correctly, they bought this at an auction in England. It's one of the few known pictures of one of the, the Lee slaves. I suppose that's her daughter. Right there. Anyway, Selena became known as, the one that saved Washington's stuff. History's full of ironies. Now, 1859. October 17th, 1859, Lee at his home in Arlington. There's a knock on the door. The messenger is none other than this guy right here. Who's that? That's Jeb Stuart. What was his nickname at West Point? Beauty. Lee was told to report to the War Department immediately. Whatever the message said, it got Lee moving, because Lee didn't even put on his uniform. Robert E. Lee had on civilian clothes. He goes to the War Department. He sits down. He might not even sit down. He is told there that there has been an insurrection at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The United States arsenal has been seized by an unknown number of insurrectionists. Now, we've read so much about John Brown and the insurrection at Harper's Ferry and all that we're immune to it. All of you are probably Civil War buffs in here. And so you've read the story so many times, but let me try one more time to bring it back to zero, okay? To start afresh. Folks, somebody seizing Harper's Ferry will be like somebody seizing Fort Hood, Texas. I mean, equate that in the modern times right here. If an unknown force seized one of our major military bases, would that not be a bit of consternation going on? Lee is dispatched. There's no troops in Washington. It's 1859. There's the detachment of Marines available from the Navy Yard, but they've already left. And so Lee gets on a telegraph. He telegraphs ahead of the train that they're on and tells them to get off at Sandy Hook, which is right outside of Harper's Ferry, and await him there. Colonel Lee has a special train left for him by the railroad, and he takes off and he goes on down chasing that train to get up with the Marines. By the time he gets to Harper's Ferry on the night of October 17th, the band, Brown's band, has already been pinned up inside the firehouse, and which I'll show you in just a second. But Robert Lee marches into Harper's Ferry, and there's all these militia, there's all these people. What is the first thing Robert E. Lee does when he gets to Harper's Ferry? He closes the bar. Colonel Lee has arrived. You're not going to be drinking whiskey and taking pot shots at the firehouse anymore. We're going to have order here. Closes the saloon. And he gets everybody in there. And he calls his lieutenant, who has accompanied him here, his de facto chief of staff, Jeb Stuart, James Ewell Brown Stuart. And he says to him, hey, this is about 2 a.m. And he says to him, hey, tomorrow morning when it's light enough, I want you to get a white flag and I want you to go to that firehouse. And I want you to give them an offer, an ultimatum. If they surrender now, they will be protected and they will receive a fair trial. If they don't, then I cannot, how did they put it? I cannot guarantee. Yeah, all guarantees are off, buddy. So what do? Jeb Stuart, I don't know, probably around 5 or 6, goes up to the firehouse door. He raps on the door. Can you imagine? He bangs on the door. There's about a 4-inch slit opens up in the door. And that face right there pokes out. Probably could see his beard before he'd see his face. Right there. And Jeb Stuart had been stationed before this in Kansas. And John Brown is known for what? Kansas. I'm going to get this one. Osawatomie. I get it? Osawatomie. Where he whacked up a bunch of pro-slavery people with broadswords. Other than that, nice guy. But Stuart recognized him. They didn't know who was in there. And Brown's got hostages. Now, you all know this story, but put yourself in the situation. There's hostages. Lee has to think now of how am I going to keep these people alive? And so what does he do? He doesn't want Brown to have time to think. If he's not going to surrender and he assumes he's not going to do it, then we're not going to waste any time. We're going to get it over with. That's how they used to fight back then, right? You don't dawdle. So Stuart steps away from the ultimatums refused. Stuart steps away. He drops his hat. And Lieutenant Israel Green of the United States Marine Corps comes forward. Not bad for off the top of my head, huh? Comes forward with sledgehammers, 3 men, with 3 men as backups, and they start hammering on that firehouse door. They get through there. I guess they knock out the bottom of it. And how'd you like to be the first one to crawl through there on your hands and knees? They crawl under there, and, nobody knows what to do. I mean, the insurrectionists, Brown's band. And they get up underneath there, and they crawl in there, and they fisticuffs. They shoot the first Marine that comes in, but the rest of them get in, and they're fighting. The lieutenant has his dress sword. Why I'm telling you this, but it's a cool story. The lieutenant has his dress sword, and he proceeds to stab John Brown. But it hits John Brown's belt buckle and breaks in half. Yeah, because it's not so it breaks in half. So what do you do then? You take the hilt of the sword and you just beat the crap out of it, at the top. So if you can imagine, seems to be some sort of a pseudo theme of this program. So they get inside there and they seize them. Brown is taken from the jail and he is interviewed. He gets pretty beat up in the whole matter. And he is interviewed by Governor Henry Wise right afterward as he's laying. This was a newspaper reporter that was there at the time. But standing there, ladies and gentlemen, is this man right here. Robert E. Lee in top hat, in civilian clothes, holding the sword right there. Lee will return on December 2nd under orders to witness the hanging of John Brown. There was rumors that some of the northern abolitionists might try to free him, and they had more guns there than, it was like Bush Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Wasn't going to happen. Now, getting toward the conclusion, Lee returns to Texas, 1859, when Twiggs surrenders. I believe he's a colonel, surrenders Texas to Confederate States forces when the war breaks out. Robert E. Lee returns back to Arlington. Virginia has not succeeded. April 16th and 17th of 1861, Robert E. Lee hears the convention is in session to consider secession. Say that one 3 times. Winfield Scott, his mentor, the General Chief of the United States Army, asked Lee the next day what he's going to do. They spent 3 hours together in his office. On April 18th, Lee meets first with Francis Blair. And Francis Blair, an emissary of Abraham Lincoln, is going to offer indirectly, or unofficially, the post of command of the United States Army, all forces. Robert E. Lee turns him down. Virginia has not made up her mind. He meets with Scott. Lee tells Scott what he has decided, what his course of action. Scott warns him in the first interview, there is no, paraphrasing, there is no room for equivocation. You must choose, Robert. You must choose. Lee doesn't want to choose. And so, Virginia goes. And on April 19th, Robert E. Lee steps into a drugstore in Alexandria, down the road from Arlington. And I don't know if the plaque's still there, but I've stood there, because they got a plaque for that too, at the apothecary. And the druggist asked Lee, I forget what he was picking up if I knew, what he thought about everything. And Lee says, I'm afraid I'm one of these dull creatures that don't see the beauty in war. I'm slightly off on that, but you get the point right there. He goes back to Arlington on April 19th, and he starts to pace And he starts to pace. Everything that I've told you, ladies and gentlemen, this whole program boils down to this moment. Everything that's molded him together, everything that has come together like this is here for him at this moment. What is Robert E. Lee going to do? He doesn't know what to do. All right? So, I always thought that Lee, and it may still be true, that Lee was heard pacing in the bedroom, in their bedroom in the upstairs second floor of Arlington. I have a Ranger friend down there named Mark Malloy, and he thinks now that the actual decision, or when Lee comes to his final conclusion, was actually not in the bedroom, but was actually in the office, which makes better sense, if you think about it. But that's what the present day thinking is of it right there. And Lee has to struggle at that desk and figure out what he's going to do. Around 2 o'clock in the morning on April 20th, Lee comes down, or comes out of the door, and he tells Mary that he has made a decision. He comes down with his letter of resignation. Right there. General, since my interview with you on 18th instant, I have felt that I ought not longer to retain any commission in the Army. I therefore tender my resignation, which I request you will recommend for acceptance. It would have been presented at once, but for the struggle it has cost me to separate myself from a service to which I have devoted all the best years of my life and all the ability I possessed. During the whole of the time, more than a quarter of a century, I have experienced nothing but kindness from my superiors and the most cordial friendships from any comrades. To no one, General, have I been more indebted as to yourself for kindness and consideration, and it has always been my ardent desire to merit your approbation. I shall carry with me to the grave the most grateful recollections of your consideration and your name and fame, and will always be dear to me. Save in the defense of my native state shall I ever again draw my sword. And that same night he sat down to write his brother and sister, who were all awaiting what Robert was going to do. They called him Robert, or Bob. Yeah, if you can imagine. And he writes his sister, I won't read this whole thing, but he wrote her on that vain night, with all my devotion to the Union and the feeling of loyalty and duty of an American citizen, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, and my home. This stuff that you see, that some people are going out and saying that, it's all about treason. It is treason. It's treason, people. Okay? Mary, I just want to emphasize to you that Robert E. Lee did not take this decision lightly, as you can see from the quote that I just said. Months later, Mary would write a friend, and she said to her, my husband has wept tears of blood over this terrible war, but as a man of honor and a Virginian, he must follow the destiny of his state. This is not post-war stuff. This is 1861, people. Now let's go back, and I'm at the end of my program right here, but I want to leave you with this because it's getting batted around so much now that we're losing sight of it. It's on my mind, not because I've sat there, but putting these slides together, I'm typing in Google, I'm typing in Robert E. Lee this, Robert E. Lee that, Robert E. Lee this. I was sitting in Ben's bed last night. I hadn't told him that part, doing all this work since he wasn't at the house. I like that light you got. That's a nice little light behind the bed right there. And I'm reading all kind of stuff. Old stuff, new stuff, the modern take on what Lee is doing. And I see the word treason all the time. And I'm like, it's all the excuse to tear down or get rid of Robert E. Lee. And I just want to take, if I could get everybody, which I guess would be a considerable sum of people, all in one room. And I just want to say to them, I'll give you an instant, I'll give you an example. I'm leading the tour last summer, going up the back trail here. I love you people. I love people in general. Greatest job in the world, Gettysburg National Military Park. I'm very blessed. I'm standing there, and that guy shows up. Okay? And he ain't even part of the group. But he wants to interject. All right. That's fine. Well, I don't know what exactly I was saying at the time, but it was something about Robert E. Lee. It was at the beginning of the tour. We were talking about Meade and Lee. And he walks up and he goes, Robert E. Lee's a traitor. He should be remembered as such. And I says, yeah, you're right, but you got one problem. He goes, what's that? I go, that guy, George Washington. I mean, you can't have it both ways here, people. You can't. George Washington swears fealty to England. And then he does what? He swears to the king. And then he does what? And Robert E. Lee in the post-war years would say exactly what I just said to you. He pointed that example out. It is truly something. And I want to leave you with this, okay? Lee struggles with the decision between what the government should do, which government he should support. We don't think like that anymore. I had a lady yesterday telling my mother and I over dinner how many places she had lived during her life, how many states she had been in. And they didn't do that much back then. You were from there. People, let's take modern times though. My family is 853 miles from here. And Ben will tell you he knows every mile of it. And by the time we hit the Mississippi State line, these kids are just hoping I don't beat them before I get... I'm just kidding. 15 hours in the car and 12 coats. Just... Wherever you're from today, wherever you're from, Illinois, California, wherever you're watching from, thank you very much. People, wherever you're from, what could your family do to you that would make you would make you go to war against them? Give me one issue. Give me one reason that you would do that. I cannot think personally what any issue that would make me take up a gun against my brother. Literally. I've thought about it, but a couple times. But I don't know. That's the dilemma that Robert E. Lee faces. This is not an easy decision. And there's no way to sit in between, ladies and gentlemen. There's no fence sitting right here. On April 22nd, ladies and gentlemen, Robert E. Lee boards a train, and he heads out and he heads down to Virginia, down to Richmond, Virginia. And as he gets down to Richmond, he walks in. Right outside there, behind this statue, you can barely see it, a little bit of wrought iron right there. It's still there in the Virginia State Capitol. Behind that wrought iron is the original statue of Whodun or Whodun. My French is not good right here. We're from Mississippi, not Louisiana. All right? We're English, Mother. English, not French, as she would always tell me. So that is the statue of Washington, the only statue made from likeness. That statue is right there, ladies and gentlemen, where Robert E. Lee stands there with those doors closed while the assembly is going through some motions or whatever not. And in conclusion, that speaker that day, as Lee walked in the door, made a passionate speech. And who did he revert back to, ladies and gentlemen? the first thing, remember, Robert E. Lee is not famous. I mean, he's well thought of as a soldier, but he's not the Lee that we know. The first thing that speaker, the Speaker of the House, does is he refers to Robert E. Lee and his father, the lineage of Light Horse Harry Lee, and the revolutionary arms that he took up. And Lee, he walks in. Of course, he didn't look anything like that. He walks into the room. He had speckled hair. He still had color in his hair at the time. It wasn't gray. He walks in, and going back to the very beginning of this program with Light Horse Harry Lee, and the quote, which my son read to you in the very beginning, what does a gentleman do? Right? He feels humbled. And Lee doesn't want any of this. He stands in front of that assembly right there. And when they get through applauding him right there, he says to them, he says these words over and over and over again. He says to them, "Save in the defense of my native state, I hope never again to draw my sword." Ladies and gentlemen, that is a little bit longer than Chris Gwynn's program. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
What's your email address at the park?
Hey, Dad, what's going on, girl? How'd it go?
You don't remember it? Oh, it's good.
I got a card. Hey, man, what's going on? I love Free.
So it's Matt_Atkinson at nps.gov. If you want to hear him on the show, you have to email him and pressure him to come on the show. Don't tell him I told you. Thank you.
Our hearts so stout have got us fame, for soon 'tis known from whence we came. Wherever we go, they dread the name of Garryowen in glory. Instead, follow drink down L and A.